This is all the way back in 2017 when I had just bought my first Studebaker. I had toyed around with it and got the engine running. I was so excited. And I'm about to take you on the journey of buying my first Studebaker. Now I wanted to show everybody what it looks like on the outside. The Studebaker Commander was a sharp looking car, and I always thought this car was a pretty good example on the outside. But looks can be a little bit deceiving. It's the original paintwork from what I can tell. But there was more than just one issue that kept this car from being on the road and truly being the project that I really wanted this thing to be.
Oh yeah.
Just as you can see, not everything is as beautiful as it is on the outside. This car has suffered many years of corrosion. Oh my God. Alright.
Alright, watch as half of my car is vacuumed away. Oh my gosh, look at that. That is insane. Wow. That is probably worse than I anticipated. Oh yeah. Wow. What is that? Is that sand and dirt? My gosh. I bought a car. Really good. Yeah, probably not ideal. I guess that gives us a starting place.
Alright, so I figured I'd make a video about everything wrong with my 1964 Studebaker Commander. So I'm making this video both to just have a video on my channel about my car, but also kind of for myself just to understand and sort of make a list and say it out loud about what all is wrong with my vehicle. Anyway, this video is just gonna kind of highlight some of the major issues or major flaws that I found that kind of sort of keeps this car off the road. So I guess I should probably back up and explain kind of the way I found it or the way that I bought this car. Only after a couple weeks of working my first job and earning a paycheck, I decided to take that money and go buy a Studebaker. When I was looking for this car, I had a small budget. It wasn't very much money. And I knew that I wanted a Studebaker. So I started, perusing Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist at the time, looking at different cars. and this one popped up. It looked like it was in fairly decent condition. And so I kind of took what money I had and decided after only a couple weeks of working my first job that I would basically go and look at this. One had popped up and it was in my price range, and I was very excited, probably a little bit too excited to buy my first Studebaker. So keep that in mind when I'm talking about the sales process. So I actually bought this off of an individual here in Texas, and it was in 2017. So this is the first Studebaker I've ever purchased or bought. I bought it, like I said, from an individual. He had actually traded for the vehicle from a father and a son. And I think the father and the son were attempting to have this as kind of a project for them both to work on. And they sort of got halfway or partly down that road a little bit. And then I guess they decided to move on from it. So when I bought it, I paid $1,200 for this car. And we towed it home. Originally it had a 6-cylinder engine in it. It had the overhead valve, Skybolt Studebaker 6-cylinder engine in it. And it also had a automatic transmission. And so once we started looking at it, we started finding a few things here and there. Obviously I knew it was going to need some work. Initially the vehicle didn't run. So we went to go look at it. We tried to start it and it did not start. So we kind of looked around it and I decided to buy it anyways. So when we went to go look at the car, the gentleman who had owned it had not owned it for very long. He had actually traded for it, I believe, on a truck. So he had traded a truck that he had for the Studebaker. He didn't know much about Studebakers and was trying to sell it and basically get rid of it. And so I saw this and I thought this would be a good project or a good place to start. I had already owned a Studebaker engine. So I owned a flathead 6-cylinder engine, which is not the same as what was inside of this vehicle. But I also thought that we might be able to install it in this car if all else failed. So anyway, I purchased this vehicle and we loaded it onto my pickup at the time and we towed it home. And my pickup was not really rated to haul this vehicle in the truck. And we got about halfway home and we realized that it was smoking out of the engine bay. And we thought, oh no, what did we do wrong? So originally when we put it on the trailer, we thought we had put it into neutral position with the transmission. And we got about halfway through the drive and realized we had not put it in neutral. So of course, once we got it home, I was very excited to dig in and see what I had to work with this car. So I opened the hood up and we started working on it, or I should say I started working on it to see what was wrong with the engine. This car didn't run when I got it, so we had tried to start it up during our test drive or our evaluation. So I got it home, tried to turn it on, and I think I hooked up a jumper pack to it. Started using the jumper pack and did some other things. So of course, once I get it home, I'm very excited to have this new project, and I immediately started working on the engine because this car didn't run at the time. So it's been about 4 or 5 years since I did this, but I'm trying to remember exactly what I did to get the engine running. I think I basically just primed the fuel pump and was able to get it going by nursing the fuel pump and then also charging the battery. And I think that was pretty much it. So it immediately ran once I started fiddling around with it. So then, of course, I was like, well, let's see if it moves. So I had it running. Let's see if it moves. And so I put the car into reverse, I remember, and it went nowhere. And then I put it into drive and it also went nowhere. So I realized that we had a vehicle that was running, but it wasn't driving. And on our way home, this is sort of a little bit of the backstory about getting this car home. So we had gotten halfway home, towing it on this underpowered truck that I had. And we looked back and there was steam coming out of the hood. And that was kind of weird. We didn't know what was going on. And immediately my buddy and I both looked at each other and were like, uh-oh, what did we miss? So we pulled over into a parking lot and I got into the passenger compartment, or I opened the door and got into the car and looked to see if it was in fact in neutral. Because earlier when we had been pushing the Studebaker up onto the car dolly, I had thought we had put it into neutral, taken the gear shifter and dropped it down into neutral. And it must have not been adjusted right or adjusted correctly because it had actually stuck in gear. So we had pulled it several miles with this car stuck in gear. And of course we were trying to do this quickly, so we didn't disconnect the drive shaft, which is probably what we should have done in the first place. But we didn't do that. So we got halfway home with this car stuck in gear, steam coming out of the transmission, and we pulled aside and realized it's stuck. It's stuck in gear. So that meant that we had damaged the automatic transmission right off the bat. So I knew that there was going to be we probably needed to go through the automatic transmission, which was going to be totally fine. I figured that that's something that I could tackle, and we could, go through it. It would have been my first automatic transmission that I had repaired. However, I have taken automatic transmission training before, and I had rebuilt one in school. So I figured that I would be okay and we could rebuild this transmission. The engine runs, but the car won't move. It won't drive. And I know that there's issues with the transmission. So I began to try and diagnose and see if there maybe is just something that we can change on the transmission while it's still in the vehicle. So I remember I pulled the transmission pan, and I think we even tried to do a fluid swap or something like that. And so I pulled the transmission pan, metal particles sitting in the pan when I pull it. And so I know that there's been some contact between the clutches, and there's probably some clutch damage. So I know that the transmission is probably ready to come out of the vehicle at this point. So I'm working by myself in my own garage, and really don't have a whole lot of help at this point. So I pull the transmission myself, actually, over a weekend. So unbolt it from the car. Of course, unbolting and removing the transmission is pretty much the easy part. So pull it out of the car, and I start to disassemble it. I can remember clearly the transmission was coated in a very heavy coat of grease. It was clear that this transmission had never been removed from the vehicle. So now that I've been talking about this, I'm sort of remembering some of these minor details that I had gone through with this transmission. So the first thing is I actually tried to buy a complete transmission unit, to find a complete transmission that somebody had rebuilt, or maybe a parts transmission, or a complete unit from anybody, basically. And so I kind of perused the internet, and I didn't really find a whole lot of complete units out there or available. I think that there were a few, but they were going to be very expensive. I found one over actually in England, because the Model 35 actually was used by Volvo in some of their cars. So I looked at Volvo forums, and I had also tried to find one in a junkyard. I think we even made a visit to a U-Pull type of junkyard to find this transmission. And then I had also looked at some of the Studebaker parts available. I think I contacted some Studebaker junkyards to see if they maybe had this transmission. And at that point, I had realized that it was probably just going to be simpler to rebuild my own. So there's a couple mistakes that I made here. And there's a couple mistakes that some other people have made. So there's there's two mistakes that I want to bring up. So the first one is, and this is a major detail about this particular transmission that up until this point, I think I've left out. And that was that the previous owner, this father and son who had been working on this project, had attempted to repair this transmission after I assume that they had pulled the oil pan, or not the oil pan, after they had pulled the transmission pan. So I assume that they were trying to service this transmission and were going back in, and they bolted the pan up into the transmission body, and something happened. I think they probably over tightened one of the pan bolts, and it actually broke the casing of the transmission. So what they had done is they had taken JB Weld and JB welded this piece back into place on the transmission housing and then put the pan back together. And that's something that was overlooked when I initially inspected the vehicle and bought this car. So I probably didn't do enough due diligence and didn't get underneath it as much as I should have. But I basically bought a car that had a broken transmission case. So my mistake in all of this is that I had pulled apart that transmission and then knocked that piece out. And then throughout the process of rebuilding this transmission, I lost the piece. And so I couldn't find it. So this little piece to this transmission was lost somewhere in my workshop. And I remember trying to overturn my workshop and try and find it. And I just looked and looked and looked. I could not find this little, it was basically just an aluminum piece that was on this transmission. So now I have this transmission that I've tried to diligently rebuild. And I felt at that point that I had done a pretty good job of rebuilding this thing and been very careful and tried to put, the right amount of clutches into it and assemble it properly to the specifications and make sure that there wasn't anything that was missing out of it, except for part of the transmission case. So that's where my mistake came in, is that I lost this piece and now had a transmission that was diligently put back together. However, it was missing a major component. So I decided, however, to put it back into the car and see if this thing would actually work. And I think I tried to plug that hole because it wasn't huge, but it was enough that it was going to leak out of this case. But I figured maybe I could seal it somehow, or I don't know. I figured let's see if this works, and then we'll figure out how to fix this leak later on. And that's basically what I did. I think I took some RTV and tried to seal it up as best as I could. Of course, that's not a very great idea. But I sealed it back up, and then I installed it into the car myself. And so this was the moment of truth. I hooked it all back up, got the drive shafts connected back together, and I started the car up and I put it into gear, and darn if it didn't go into reverse. This thing managed to move and I was like ecstatic. I was so excited. It went into reverse. Okay, let's see if it goes into drive. And so I put it into drive and it moved. It worked. And it was leaking fluid all over the place, but the transmission was basically functioning and the car was running, and I was just so ecstatic. I was so excited. I had a running Studebaker and now the thing was driving. So the first thing that I did is I put it into reverse and I backed it into the driveway, and it leaked fluid all over the place. It was really bad. But it was moving, it was driving. I'd taken this car that didn't run. I've made it run. It didn't drive. I made it somewhat drive. So I was pretty excited at this point. So once I got this car running and driving, of course, I started experimenting like any good gearhead. And I would move it back and forth inside and outside of the garage. And then I got a little braver and started moving it into the cul-de-sac near my apartment complex. And then, of course, driving it around the apartment complex. Then one day I got really brave and decided to drive across the street to the gas station. And that was a pretty big adventure. And then I said, hey, I wonder if it would make it all the way over to that parking lot across the street. All the while, of course, spewing automatic transmission fluid everywhere. You can see it in this photo below the car is a little trail of automatic transmission fluid. And I'm just driving out there having a ball, of course, in the haze of automatic transmission fluid, refilling and filling back up. But the biggest day I ever had with it, I took it 14 miles. It made it all that way. Of course, I had to fill it up several times, but it seemed to do just fine, and I drove it all the way to Sonic and got myself a nice little cold beverage. And of course, during this whole time, I'm just taking tons of photos after photo after photo of this great car and really enjoyed it. But the problem was it was still leaking and it wasn't quite fixed the way that I wanted it to. And after driving it those 14 miles, I tried to drive it again and it would not go anywhere. It had pretty much burned up all the clutch material from my rebuild job. So I actually pulled the transmission again, and several of my buddies pulled it back apart, and we actually went through all the clutches again and put new clutch material in. But when we were trying to put the automatic transmission back into the car, we were not able to mate it to the torque converter correctly. We tried for about 2 to 3 hours, several different ways, and then we stopped. We came back at it, and we tried again for another couple hours, and still could not get this transmission onto the torque converter. So we decided that it was probably going to require us to remove the engine and then put the engine and transmission together and see if we couldn't drop it in the car as a unit. So the engine got removed from the car. I had my friend help me do that. But while it was sitting there, I, of course, was always perusing the parts websites for the local wrecking yards. And one day I just happened to come across a Studebaker Lark that was sitting in a U-Pullet yard. And it turns out it had a manual transmission, which was exactly what I wanted. So instead of deciding to try and fix the automatic transmission again and install it back in the car, we decided to take everything out of this car and try and put it into my Studebaker. So I spent several days. I even took off work to be able to go and take all the parts I could off of this car. And I really scavenged a lot of parts off this thing. I was really under the gun and up against the clock as this car was being crushed, and it did eventually get crushed. But one thing I wish I would have gotten was the crossmember that came out of this car, because mine has an automatic crossmember for an automatic transmission, and this is obviously a manual car. I didn't think to get it at the time, but this would later prove to be one of the issues as to why I was unable to install that manual transmission into my car. But even after the junkyard, I brought most of the stuff home and very carefully organized everything into Ziploc bags with all the hardware and associated components, and really took a lot of time to do that right, and cleaned up a lot of components, including repainting some areas that might have needed some touch up after years of rust or corrosion. And then I made the decision to pull the engine apart because I figured the engine was a little bit tired and I would go ahead and rebuild that while it was out of the car as well. And I have this thing pulled apart and really stripped it down to the block. And I even got the manual transmission rebuilt, and things were really looking up at this point. Like this project might come together. As you can see from the photos, we rebuilt the transmission and we're about ready to put it back into the car. And that's when we realized the crossmember was incorrect for a manual transmission vehicle, and we couldn't put that in there. And to make matters worse, I was then relocated for my job, and so I had to pack up the entire project and put it on the back of a U-Haul. So here we are back in current day as the project has slowly progressed. So upon initially seeing these self-tapping screws and seeing this in here when I was initially buying this vehicle, I had figured that they had previously removed the rusted metal from the floor pans, and then taken these new sheets of metal and then put in self-tapping screws. But as I got further into this project, I realized that was not the case. So to show that further, we're actually going to have to take a visit underneath the car. So now we're underneath the car, and as you can see, the metal was actually never removed, which is both a good thing and a bad thing, because it means that this could potentially be fixed using new floor pans and actually doing it the right way. But as you can see, these of course rusted through, and then they just took the sheet, and right there's one of the self-tapping screws. They took the metal and just put it directly underneath the already rusting floor. So, well, I guess this would be something that I would want to fix and do it the right way. Of course, get actual floor plans and then weld them into place. So this is initially what I found underneath the car. And of course, I was a little bit disappointed to know that, you know, this is how this was repaired, but that's neither here nor there. So this was the first part of corrosion that I really found on the vehicle. Of course, I knew that there was going to be some with this car. So unfortunately, they had never removed the carpet out of the back. And once I did that, that's when I found this. Started looking, and as you can see, in this rear section of the car, I'm actually in the back seat. These corners here have basically rusted all the way through. So there would be some major rust repair that would need to occur on this car. Of course, it's rotted basically all through the corner here. And so that would have to be fixed. You can actually see the frame of the body here in these channels. So yeah, that's I would say that's a pretty big component of some of this. So even if we get the right cross member in there, the right transmission, the right engine, it's still going to need some major body work to even really be functional. So this is over on the driver's side, and this is in the rear. We're facing from the rear towards the front, and as you can see in these corners, there is quite a bit of corrosion here that would need to be addressed. So basically there's some major areas of the floor that would need to be replaced with new metal. So the next thing it needs is as you can see, it's got 3 pedals. I took the 3rd pedal out of that car that was at that junkyard. We're looking at, so we've got the 3 pedals that it needs. It's got the clutch. What it really needs is all the linkages put in to be able to make so basically I need to finish up the manual transmission project to be able to get all the linkages in there. And then this steering wheel needs to be finished out, continuing to put all the brackets and components into place so that it can properly shift with the manual transmission in there. So this next part is the door and the window. So while I've had the car, the window regulator broke, and the window's unfortunately down into the door panel, and so that needs to be repaired. Actually, there's a small plastic piece that broke inside the window regulator, and so allowed the window to go down. I've talked to a couple members of the club, and they said I can obtain one from that's a Ford part and be able to install that, and it's pretty simple or straightforward. But I do need to get the window back into place so that this car can be okay and sit in the elements. That way it can run properly. Okay, so I did want to show the engine. This is kind of the current state of affairs with going on with the engine. I've got it up on the stand, and I painted it and disassembled most of the major components. So at this point, though, I probably want to take it to a machine shop, actually, and have the deck surfaced and have the head, along with 2 heads that I have for this engine, and have them hot tanked, then machined, and then probably checked for cracks. But this is kind of the current state of affairs. Like I said, I was in the process of rebuilding this, and then life happened, and basically I put most of this project into crates, and was moving across the country twice in a matter of about 2 or 3 years. So I'm in the process of trying to find a machine shop here in Dallas that will do the work, and hopefully we'll be able to find somebody that wants to do that. So I guess in summary, this car needs quite a bit of work. The engine's going to have to be rebuilt. The transmission is basically dependent on if a cross member can be obtained, and then if you can get the current cross member out of the vehicle, that would be a whole nother challenge in of itself. Of course, rebuilding all the floors in the car, and then there's various other things that would need work as well, such as the dash that I didn't really point out, or the muffler and the exhaust system that would need basically a whole revision. This car is something I bought when I was in a little bit different stage of life, when I was mainly looking for a project and wanted something to really dig my heels into and work on. And I think for the most part, I did succeed in some of that. I was able to take it from just a regular old Studebaker that wasn't running or driving, and I did get it running and driving and got to drive it 14 miles, although it was in far more need of repair than really I think I estimated. And so I maybe bit off more than I could chew as far as a big project with Studebakers. And so now I'm in a point in my life where I just want to be able to tinker and work on a Studebaker at the end of the week, and drive it to shows and that sort of thing. So really, when I'm considering my own goals, something that runs and drives, you can easily get that for 10 to 15,000 with cash, and go buy one that runs already, versus sinking in a lot of time and money. If I did that, I would actually just have a rusted out sedan. So you've seen basically everything where this car's at, and so I'm curious to see what other owners and other car enthusiasts think. I guess put down in the comments if you think this car is worth saving or not.